Now, what I'm not planning to do is have a conversation about tools that you might use to do risk analysis and understand what your risk profiles look like. And I'm not going to talk about the sort of matrices that are involved and all that sort of stuff, because as I started to put this together, what became kind of clear to me was I'm starting to hear a lot of CPOs and senior people in procurement talking about the profession being the custodians of supply chain risk management, which is really quite interesting for me to hear that, because it's kind of a move into areas that I may or may not have a view about our capability to do it. So I kind of think what I'd like to talk about today a little bit more is, are we as professional procurement people equipped to fulfill the role of custodians of supply chains? And one of the things that we'll talk about, I'll talk a little bit about how I think risk, certainly in my experience, has evolved over the years and become much more difficult, if not impossible, to quantify and anticipate. We'll talk about what I think we as a profession need to be aware of, and we'll talk about a little bit about what current state. So what I've decided to do, and I thought through a little bit, and I decided to outline for you some of, not all, but some of the specific supply chain risks that I've encountered throughout my career. And as I wandered down that journey of reflection, it was quite interesting to look back at some of the scar tissue. I don't know if I've got anybody in the room from print or with a print background or manages print as a commodity. Somebody here from Delarue, so they would probably understand it. My first real exposure to supply chain risk happened back in 1994. When I was then the print strategy lead within what was then the post office. And at that point in time, the market moved. NBSK is Northern Bleach Softwood Kraft. It's the sort of de facto standard for pulp that everybody uses. And it moved in the space of probably about 14 months. It moved from 380 bucks a ton to 940. Now, in a marketplace where you're able to just add margin back onto that, that's fine. You manage your risk that way. However, what had happened was in the post office at that point in time, who was providing services for most of the other government agencies. And there's a little bit of history in this, so some of the younger people may not get this. They had entered into a firm fixed pricing contract deal with government, all the government agencies, for product that was available within the post office retail network, so the Crown offices and the sub-post offices. That was a little bit lunacy, but that's where they were. So as a consequence, the post office was hemorrhaging cash hand over fist because it hadn't hedged against what might happen there. So nobody was really kind of across that supply chain risk. For reasons that still remain a mystery, I was drafted in to try and come up with some solutions to mitigate that risk and put the organisation on a better footing going forward. Obviously, the first one was to renegotiate the deals with all the government agencies. I'm sure you can guess how successful that was. It just didn't happen. But what it actually did do for the organisation, and it's not uncommon through all the supply chain sort of catastrophes, is that it actually set it down the road towards digital. So in old money, when you went into a Crown office, the walls were littered with bits of paper. If you wanted to buy a TV licence, if you wanted to buy a fishing licence, if you wanted to deposit money in National Giro Bank, all very paper orientated, all around the walls. Go into a modern office now, on any retail network, you'll not see that. So something good kind of came out of that particular supply chain disaster. I've been involved in 3 fuel crises in my career, which has been very, very good. The big one in the noughties, 05 and 07. At that point, I was the transport category lead for Royal Mail. And as you might imagine, those fuel crises were quite interesting for us. We had a universal service obligation. And we had to then put in play some supply chain mitigation that would allow us to maintain that USO. But equally, and certainly around 2005, when the competition began to bite, it became much more of not just a service provision to the greater community, it became a war of attrition with competitors such as TNT, for example. And I think we did a pretty good job of managing that. We were still able to perform the services of the organisation 2 or 3 weeks after most of our competitors had run out of fuel. So we had quite a good way of doing that. We understood it and we managed it pretty effectively. Y2K, we've all been through that, haven't we? Y2K is quite interesting. I did a wee bit of analysis. Apparently Y2K cost business £412 billion in today's money. I reckon we probably funded a hell of a lot of that with Y2K consultants who came out of nowhere to make sure planes weren't going to drop out of the sky and hospitals weren't going to shut down. But what it did do was it completely changed the profile of how coding was done and how programmers started to work and integrate how they were working that through. And then, of course, the financial crisis in 07, 08, that was really good. That got me loads of upgrades on flights because there was nobody else on it. That was great, and I was flying back and forth to Beijing. But what it really did for my organisation, Royal Mail at the time, was it gave us real issues around our suppliers and their ability to raise cash and get investment funding and trade. And we had a lot of organisations that were borderline on the way of going out of business as a consequence of that. And it's also quite interesting. So back to the top, NBSK, it wasn't a demand issue. It wasn't that pulp wasn't available. It had nothing to do with that whatsoever. It was just around pricing embargoes and trade restraint. The fuel crisis wasn't really driven by demand or supply. Actually, the latter two were driven by politics. If you'll remember, it was guys that were going up and parking their tankers around the big refineries, saying we're paying too much tax for the fuel. So it wasn't standard supply or demand. It was a political issue. The whole Y2K thing, that was the first sort of technology blip that everybody was having to deal with. And the financial crisis, well, I guess that was something that nobody seen coming, except I think we had a discussion last night, one commentator called Lehman going south before the event. So it was quite interesting what the drivers were behind it. So I decided I would have a look and see what the definition is. This definition must be right because it's from Wikipedia. Which I find quite interesting, and I can kind of subscribe to a lot of it. The implementation of strategies to manage everyday and exceptional risks along the supply chain, continuous risk assessment with the objective of reducing vulnerability. What I find more interesting about that is the language that's not called out in bold letters. So I'm not sure that this was written by somebody who actually has any responsibility for supply chain risk management. The words that are interesting for me in this is implementation and strategies, so doing things. The worrying bit is every day, I can kind of deal with every day, and exceptional, that's an interesting call, and continuous assessment and ensuring continuity. Now what I would argue is that's a pretty big check for our profession to write if we believe that we are the custodians of supply chain risk management. Because I think those things are very, very hard to foresee, very, very hard to manage. And it's almost a little bit like trying to manage the cause rather than the consequences. And that's quite interesting if we, as a professional group of procurement people, think that we should be signing up to that and putting our hands up in the world of we will manage that on behalf of our corporates. However, historically, what have we tried to manage? A few familiar ones up here for you. And we can I can kind of see how we can do this. So obviously logistics failures that we've had, that's not a picture of the Mall Comfort. The Mall Comfort was a very famous ship that lost 4,500 40-foot cube containers to the bottom of the ocean when it broke its back some time ago. Unexpected item in the bagging area, one of my favourite names that came through on the internet, and that's managing sort of how supply chains get corrupted and how that happens. Interestingly in that one, again some of the numbers, that particular incident with Tesco took £300 million out of their profit line. And interestingly, the Mall Comfort one, they've never been able to fully quantify what that has cost the organisations because they were never able to fully quantify what was in the 40-foot containers. And that's caused significant environment and actually forced the customs clearance processes to get much more crisp around the world. Fukushima on the bottom left-hand side. Now this one is quite interesting in terms of the organisations that were directly impacted by it. This crippled the production capability of 3 organisations. Sony, Honda, and Toyota all went down as a consequence of Fukushima. Not sure how Nissan went, but
we were down for a short one, but that was pretty good.
what was interesting about Toyota was because we all, certainly as a certain vintage of this similar era, we were extolled the virtues of the Toyota lean model. And a lot of things that Toyota did that we tried to emulate to a greater or lesser extent, which was ensure that your critical suppliers are within a 5-mile radius. Well, actually, that's great until that happens. Because not only do you take yourself out, but you take all those key suppliers out, because that was part of the contract of doing business with Toyota. So there's been a bit of learning then. And then, of course, the most recent one, which I think is quite interesting, and I had a specific interest in it, was Samsung Note 7. A catalogue of disasters in terms of how you manage supply chain disruption at this level. So first of all, they make a product that doesn't work. Well, that's okay. That happens. Recognize it doesn't work. They then do the recall. So the advice to the consumer base from Samsung was, bring your product, stick it in a jiffy bag, send it back to us via Royal Mail or TNT or any of the other carriers, who were massively enthused at the prospect of getting new product lines coming through that could actually take their own infrastructure out. And Samsung got fined for that. You would have thought that somebody somewhere would have went, that's not the right way to do it. And then compounded yet again by reissuing a new product that had the same fault. So these sorts of things are all very interesting. This Note 7 one, I believe at the last count, they've lost 1.58 billion in terms of that. So very interesting. But the question for me actually is, I wonder in those organizations that were all affected in this way, who was it put their hand up and said, I'm the person who was responsible for the supply chain in this and the supply chain risk management? And I don't know who it was, but I certainly hope it wasn't somebody from procurement. The traditional risks that I think we do kind of manage is obviously, and it's the typical category management type stuff, the ASCII model, assurance of supply, quality, supplier financial risk, all those sorts of things. And these are typically the sorts of things then that sit in those category strategies that have risk management wrapped around them. So what is it that we're going to do in these areas that we can manage? And most of them now, we've got a reasonably good handle on how you might approach that and the tools and the techniques that you might use. But again, I ask you this question, did it work in the previous examples? I'll let you be the judge of that. But the new variables that compound this and make it much more difficult to manage and assess and work through what those supply chain risks might be, where we now have brand and reputational damage, anti-bribery and corruption. It is on public record. I'm not with the press anymore, by the way, but it is on public record that Oxford University Press were censured by the World Bank. Now, the press is not an organisation that typically you would expect to flirt on the edges of any compliance issue. But it happened in Kenya, in Africa, and they were censured for 3 years. Now, of course, it's focused that sort of attention, but it wasn't a risk that they had in their psyche, in their mindset that they were thinking about on a day-to-day basis. It came in from left field and it caught them cold. Modern Slavery Act. It's quite interesting. I mean, I was doing a piece on modern slavery when I was at the press. Didn't know an awful lot about it at that time. Had done China, understood labour rights and child labour, understood all that stuff. Didn't quite understand modern slavery. When we did the analysis, we found out that the biggest risk in terms of a modern slavery compliance breach is in the catering industry, of all places. I thought it would have been in clothing, textiles, those sorts of manufacture. No, catering, because it's typically where these people migrate to whenever they come into work in other organisations, other countries. We've got to manage revenue damage. We've got geopolitics to worry about. We've got Brexit. Still waiting to find out exactly what Brexit's going to mean for us, but you know, and loads of unknown unknowns. So the people who are going to take ownership and put their hand up to manage that have to factor the traditional stuff that we're aware of and the new variables as well. And they're going to change all the time. Now, a point that will become a little bit apparent towards the end of this presentation. I don't know if anybody in here gambles. Anybody do accumulator bets? Surely it's not just me. The more you add on to this, the potential for these things to go wrong exponentially increase massively. So my question is, with all these variables in play, do procurement want to stand up and go, we are the custodians of supply chain risk? So what's changed? So a lot of CEOs that I've dealt with, I'll not call them all out, but a lot of them have got it. A lot of them can sit down and you can have a conversation about supply chain risk, and they'll understand that. They get all those issues. They realize brand reputational damage, revenue protection, compliance issues are being oxed. They get all that, and they can talk to it eloquently and at length. But worryingly, what I do get to hear quite often is, yeah, I get all that, but it's all about the cost, right? Those individuals, you need to stay well away from them, but they are out there. And what has really changed? Well, actually, in my experience over the last 30 years of what I've been involved in, I think there's a few things that have happened. There is now a lack of agility through supplier consolidation. It's kind of part of procurement's holy grail. Cut the supply base down, cut the tail out, do all these things. When I came in and worked in Royal Mail originally, and I asked about managing supply chain risk around NBASK, it was actually quite simple. My boss said, here's how we manage it. We dual source or we triple source. Dead simple. You're not going to get the best price. You're not going to get the love and attention that you might want, but you're making sure that your sources of supply are protected and integrated. What we have done now with supplier consolidation is we've chased the buck, we've consolidated it, we've taken all our money and we've bet one horse. Staying with the gambling analogy. And that causes problems because that then gives us a single point of failure in terms of some of those relationships. Let's focus on our core. I don't know if anybody's heard that. Yeah. The big debate, in-source, outsource, what is our core? I think a lot of organizations actually don't understand what their core is. But what's that done? That's taken large swathes of delivery, of ability to control and manufacture or provide services, and it's put it outside the organization. More multiple points of failure. And then how can we drive scale? Well, that typically, in the worlds that I've been most directly involved in, has been consolidation of warehouses, consolidation of logistics, make them bigger, work the asset better, drive efficiency, drive the scale. And that's all okay. And we as a professional community, we've went out and we've said, absolutely, we can do all that. And the other thing which is interesting about it is, when we have done it as a professional community, we have probably claimed the benefits for it. We have probably said, here's your cost avoidance, here's your cost reduction. We have waved the flag and said, we're pretty good at all this sort of stuff, aren't we? But that's a double-edged sword. So those are the sorts of things that I think are the eternal truths in terms of making supply risk management tricky. But then what's really interesting is, we then badged ourselves as being these knights that were going to go out and manage all that. And lo and behold, in the August publication, Supply Management Magazine, of which I was on the editorial advisory board for a long period of time, only a month or two ago, we put this out there as a community. We said 56% of our community don't feel that they're able to conduct cost-benefit analysis. Oh dear. 70% ask for business continuity plans, 30% don't. And then this one, which I think is actually a little bit delinquent of us, is the fact that 41% do not monitor, don't know, or have not considered recovery strategies after contract award. We published this. There you go. We put it out there. So I think if we're going to do this sort of stuff, there's a few things that we're going to need to get right. And really, there's three key things for me, one of which is a little bit contentious. So investment, and by investment, yes, I'm talking about the tools, software applications, all the things that we can do to better understand risk and understand and quantify and do probability analysis, all that good and sexy stuff. But there's almost investment as well in terms of maybe paying more for our goods and services to protect that. Maybe having multiple suppliers in very critical supply chains that our organizations need to have, and to work with them more effectively. Training, I don't see, and I see a lot of category strategies and see a lot of papers, I don't see an awful lot of the more junior, perhaps even the more senior procurement professionals that are really across how to do this. And we were having a conversation last night, Alan and I, and in terms of if I was going to train somebody now coming into the profession who was going to carry the cross of supply chain risk management, I actually think there's a few suppliers that I might send them to. I might send them to Ladbrokes, I might send them to Paddy Power, and I might send them to Betfair. Because those organisations, that's what they do for a day job. That's how they make money. And I'm not sure we are really investing in ourselves and the people coming through in the profession to do this. And finally, for me, it's an inclusion. Who else needs to be involved in this? Well, obviously, the supply chain people themselves need to be involved in it. But again, when I look at a lot of risk mitigation plans, there's one glaring absence for me. There are a few notable exceptions, to be fair, but there's one kind of glaring absence. I very rarely see the customers involved in it. I very rarely see big organisations saying to their key clients, we recognise that the risk of supply chain failure is quite high. There is a high probability, some of it we can't even see. What does it mean for you? And bring that into the overall debate as well. Because I think without that, we get slightly myopic and we don't look necessarily through the right lens. Or alternatively, we can do what the figures seem to be suggesting that we're doing at the minute, which is just keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. And when it all goes wrong, we'll blame someone else. So thank you for your forbearance and patience. Hopefully it's a little bit provocative. Questions?